This is a character analysis of Tim O'Brien from the series of narratives The Things They Carried, presented by Gloria, Setareh, Krithi, and Brittany. Tim O'Brien is not only the author of the book The Things They Carried, but also appears as the narrator throughout each anecdote. O'Brien creates a new form of storytelling in which he incorporates himself into the book. Although many of the anecdotes the narrator O'Brien recounts are fictional, the commentary communicates a sense of humanity. In essence, it is up to the reader to differentiate between the author and the narrator, even when they seem to blend together into one person. The narrator's voice is important because it relays information about relationships with other characters, as well as progressing the plot of each anecdote. For example, O'Brien as an author never had a daughter, and Kiowa, a man in his unit, was not a real person. But through the stories he created, the narrator's grief was palpable, and the readers were impacted by the raw, fervent emotions. Tim O'Brien's major goals vary from chapter to chapter, and it becomes difficult to differentiate between the goals of author Tim O'Brien versus narrator Tim O'Brien. For example, in the last chapter, The Lives of the Dead, the author O'Brien's major goal is to let go of his grief-stricken past by writing about his bonds. However, the narrator's goals are much different. During the beginning of the book, narrator O'Brien seems naive and innocent, his only goal being to endure the war to go back to his normal life as a college student. Throughout the anecdotes, O'Brien's goal changes as the war's experiences help him shift his outlook on life. This is illustrated by O'Brien's description of life after Vietnam. I couldn't feel much, not sadness or pity or passion, and somehow I blamed Vietnam for what I had become, all the vulgarity and horror. The narrator O'Brien's goal shifted to keeping his comrades close and sustaining the bonds between them, and later to remembering the war and moving on from his grief. O'Brien's actions are largely driven by fear, shame, but later shift into pride as O'Brien's character grows and learns from experience. For example, during his retelling of On the Rainy River, O'Brien describes that fleeing to Canada was an act of bravery, but the decision to join the war was shameful. When O'Brien states, "I was a coward, I went to the war," it is clear that his fear of being humiliated by his family and friends and of being a disgrace to his country drove him to grudgingly make the commitment to war. Shame forced O'Brien to make his decisions under pressure, but in the same vein gave rise to courage, pride, and a shift in his view of the war. Later in the story, O'Brien's perspective on war has changed. He now understands that fighting in the war is an honorable commitment, and that the war is not simply an obstacle to be surpassed. O'Brien's insistence on taking revenge on Bobby Jorgensen for his humiliating experience of being shot is one example of how his pride drove his actions. O'Brien has also matured enough to let go of that pride and forgive Jorgensen, which is evident when he recounts, "I hated him for making me stop hating him." After enduring the hardships of war, O'Brien's actions are not driven by fear and shame, but by a need to maintain the bonds he has created with his fellow comrades throughout those hardships.
Before the war, O'Brien is represented as a character of innocence as he is free from the burdens and traumas that come with the war. During this time, his virtues dominated his morals, such as when he felt much guilt over the man he first killed. While O'Brien is staring at the dead body, Kiowa says to him, "Man, I'm sorry. Why not talk about it? Come on, man, talk." Since he feels a heavy burden of guilt and shame, O'Brien is unable to speak about what he had done. This conveys how his virtues, the goodness and morality in him, dominate his beliefs when he first entered the Vietnam War. However, over time, the war slowly corrodes away his virtues and his vices start to form. The experiences from using killing as the only solution to live and win the war causes him to lose his sense of who he was before, an upright, honorable, and Harvard-bound young high school student. In the chapter The Ghost Soldiers, O'Brien describes this transition as, "For all my education, all my fine liberal values, I now felt deep coldness inside me, something dark and beyond reason. It's a hard thing to admit, even to myself, but I was capable of evil." By this point in the book, O'Brien has been fully dominated by his vices, which he addresses during a period of self-realization. He has to accept the fact that he is no longer the person he once was, but more violent and rageful. As a result, he cannot go back to his original life and the future he once planned. This new dominance of vices impacts other characters, especially the new medic Bobby Jorgensen. Ever since O'Brien got shot during an open-fire attack, he held a personal vendetta against Jorgensen due to Jorgensen's inability to give him immediate help and not correctly treating the wound for shock. This causes O'Brien to play a prank on Jorgensen by making him feel the same amount of fear O'Brien felt when he thought he was going to die from his gunshot wound. While remembering the traumatic experience from the pain to the anger, O'Brien says, "Number 1, the guy had almost killed me. Number 2, there had to be consequences." Overcome with vengeance, O'Brien has transitioned from a pure-hearted young man to a soldier who believes in the eye-for-an-eye justice system. No longer does his virtues show true in his character as he becomes someone who enjoys the fear and the pain of others seen with Jorgensen. Overall, O'Brien, who was once an essence of innocence, succumbs to the dark nature of war by letting the vices of violence and rage become the new immoral standards he believes in following.
Tim O'Brien experienced numerous conflicts throughout the novel. At the beginning, he was an innocent young man who wanted nothing to do with the war. He described himself as a liberal who doesn't approve of such violent actions as described in the chapter On the Rainy River. O'Brien exclaims that, quote, he is a liberal for Christ's sake, and that his emotions went from, quote, rage in my stomach to smoldering self-pity to finally numbness. As he considered fleeing to Canada to evade the draft, he went through a, quote, moral split. He not only feared the war, but he also feared exile. Ultimately, he went to the war out of cowardice. As he toughened up during the war, his personality shifted, still being a good soul, but with stronger emotions and more anger. He develops a conflict with the new medic, Bobby Jorgensen, which displays his newfound anger. At first, it seems rightful, because Jorgensen left O'Brien to almost die from shock from a bullet wound. However, Jorgensen later apologizes and, quote, it almost made O'Brien feel guilty. Not quite, though. Despite previously being a thoughtful, anti-violence college student, he is now consumed by the desire to get revenge on Jorgensen. He, quote, now felt a deep coldness inside himself, something dark and beyond reason, capable of evil. This man-versus-man conflict leads him to perform a psychological prank on Jorgensen, lighting noisemakers and flares to scare him on his night watch. His behavior here is a result of his experiences in the war. O'Brien's conflicts with society are shown at the same time that he is having internal conflicts, where he blames his community for his guilt. O'Brien complains, quote, my hometown was a conservative little spot on the prairie, a place where tradition counted, and it was easy to imagine people sitting around, the conversation slowly zeroing in on the young O'Brien kid, how the sissy had taken off for Canada. In essence, his fate was sealed by society. The fear crushed O'Brien's thought process and threw him into the war despite his hesitation.
One of the themes O'Brien the character furthers is memory, truth, and storytelling. In The Man I Killed, O'Brien humanizes a young man he shot, telling a story about how the young man would not have wanted to be a soldier and in his heart would have feared performing badly in battle. This is mostly self-projected, reflecting O'Brien's fears of entering the war in On the Rainy River. By inventing the young man's past through storytelling, he tries to bring the man back alive, even temporarily. However, in good form, he tells us that his stories, including the man he killed, are made up. The young boy was not a life he took by his own hands, but just a corpse he saw in the field. Despite the seeming immorality of falsifying these stories, he claims what stories can do is make things present. Regardless of the truth, the experiences and emotions conveyed from the story are real enough that the facts scarcely matter. Even if he didn't kill the man, he felt as if he did, which in his memory is more real than the truth. His stories of the dead boy shape his memory and his perceived truth of the events that actually occurred. This lack of continuity brings ambiguity into his stories, mixing fact and fiction together and muddling the truth. In The Lives of the Dead, O'Brien recounts his memories of his dead friends, making up stories to cope with their deaths. Whether it be his 9-year-old first love or his war comrades, he keeps the dead alive with stories. Inventing false stories eases his grief by bringing his friends back temporarily, but it slowly erodes away the real dead person. He's still dreaming Linda alive in exactly the same way. She's mostly made up, with a new identity and a new name, like the man who never was. Despite both Lindas being his 9-year-old first love, the stories he has created has made a new Linda. O'Brien tells stories to cope with his memory of the truth, which often results in the story truth separating from the real truth.
For our visual component, we decided to depict O'Brien's character of who he becomes before and after the war. In the beginning of the book, he is represented as a normal young high schooler who was unfortunate enough to be drafted into the war. At first, he holds the same skills and beliefs as a normal young adult. He fears the death and the murder in the war and talks about how he doesn't even know the difference between a slingshot and a rifle. However, towards the end of the book, O'Brien has learned to accept this new way of life as he finds a sort of comfort in the fighting and the violence. The right side of our visual component represents this as the emotional darkness behind the exterior of a normal man. Who O'Brien becomes is a person he calls that is capable of evil. He fears how much this dark and ruthless nature of himself that he enjoys, and recognizes the difference of who he became as a result of the war.
You can check out these links for other parts of the character analysis. Thank you for listening to this comprehensive analysis on Tim O'Brien from The Things They Carried.